Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us to celebrate the launch of the Shalvi Hyman Encyclopedia of Jewish Women. I'm Judith Rosenbaum, the CEO of the Jewish Women's Archive, and we are so excited to have the opportunity in this Global Day of Learning to showcase some of the encyclopedia's new content. The Shalvi Hyman Encyclopedia of Jewish Women is the culmination not just of the 4 years of work on this edition, it also builds on a foundation that includes the original 1997 Jewish Women in America Encyclopedia, edited by Deborah Dashmore and Paula Hyman, as well as the 2006 Jewish Women, a Comprehensive Historical Encyclopedia, published by Moshe Shalvi and edited by Paula Hyman and Delia Ofer, which was then incorporated into the Jewish Women's Archive in 2009. We brought it onto our site. It made it freely accessible to users around the world. And I'm very proud to say that the encyclopedia now gets more than 1.6 million unique visitors per year. This edition, which is renamed the Shalvi Hyman Encyclopedia in memory of Moshe Shalvi and Paula Hyman, and in honor of the pioneering Israeli feminist Alice Shalvi, who we'll have the opportunity to hear from later today, represents a major and ongoing effort to update, revise, expand, and redesign the encyclopedia. And going forward, we're going to be continuing to revise and add as the online format makes possible. In creating this edition, we paid particular attention to the underrepresented areas and topics in the originals, including Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews, Jews of color, Jews in the Global South, LGBTQ Jews, and Jews with disabilities, and much more. And so I urge you to explore and learn. I also just want to say that my commitment to this project is both professional and personal. Obviously, as the director of JWA, it's really important to me to keep our core content accessible and on the cutting edge. But also as a daughter, it was very important to me to make sure that the work that had been so important to my mother, Paula Hyman, and which was a big part of her legacy, would remain relevant and alive. And I feel incredibly grateful and honored to be able to do this work. Before we begin our conversation, I have some very important thank yous to share. First of all, to Jenny Sartori, the editor who directed this project from beginning to end. From the biggest conceptualizations to the smallest administrative details, she held it all and did an incredible, incredible job. We were also extremely lucky to have a wonderful editorial board of nearly 60 scholars from around the world who helped us with the big questions, as well as reviewing content and suggesting new topics and authors. We worked with a wonderful team of interns and assistants who helped us track down images and edit and upload. And I also particularly want to thank our web developer, Patrick Dash, who built the web structure and implemented the new design, which was an enormous project, given how much content and how many pages are in this encyclopedia. Last but not least, I, of course, want to thank our donors who understood the importance and impact of the encyclopedia and whose investment in this project made it a reality. As I mentioned, this project is ongoing and would not be possible without the continued support of our users and audience. And we are so grateful to everyone who's already contributed to the encyclopedia and to this event. If you're interested ever in making a gift to JWA, it's very easy to do so at jwa.org/donate. And I thank you. As I mentioned, this launch event is designed to give you a taste of the wide range of content in the encyclopedia, both in terms of topics, scholar, geography. JWA has been holding virtual events almost weekly since the pandemic began in March of 2020, with hundreds of attendees each week. But I will say that our usual time slot on Thursday evenings Eastern time wasn't necessarily accessible to people around the world. So this day of learning has been designed to welcome our global audience. And I encourage you to please introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're from. Make sure to chat to panelists and attendees so that we can all see, and also put in your questions, and we'll be sure to bring those in the later part of our conversation. So I'm delighted to introduce our presenter for this session. Zohar Weiman-Kelman is a senior lecturer in the Department of Foreign Literatures and Linguistics and holds the Bleckner Career Development Chair in East European Jewish Culture at Ben-Gurion University. They received a PhD in comparative literature from the University of California, Berkeley, and were a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Jewish Studies and the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. Zohar was also a fellow at the Katz Center for Advanced Jewish Studies and an associate scholar at the Humanities Forum on Sex, both at the University of Pennsylvania. Their first book, Queer Expectations, A Genealogy of Jewish Women's Poetry, was published by SUNY Press in 2018, and Zohar is currently working on a new project, Unarchiving Yiddish Sex. Welcome, Zohar. So glad to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here. I'm going to share my screen so you have my presentation, and I think it's also going to be sent out to you as a PDF in the chat. So you might want that to follow along with some of the poems, which I am very excited to introduce you to. I'm just going to set up my screen so I see everything at the same time. Great. I'm really, as I said, thrilled to be here today in this conversation because I am a huge fan of the Shalvi Hyman Encyclopedia, which to me is a dream come true of the movement across time between Jewish women, the way that different women from Jewish history become adjacent to each other by virtue of one click of the mouse. Which is in some way an enactment of the queer dream, which I hope to share with you today. So I'm calling it queer in the sense of the way we're going to see Jewish women across the past 100 years expressing lesbian desire, queer desire, but also queer in the sense that the movements it produces between time, the way a poet from the 19th century and a poet from the 1970s can be in this click away conversation I'm calling queer because it really disrupts the normative division between past and present. So I'll show you a little bit how I play with this, and I'll show you a little bit how I play with the encyclopedia itself. I want to start with the poet Emma Lazarus, who, let's see, no, if I can move that. This actually page, it's not from the, it's from the Women of Valor exhibit, but the links below are clickable, so you can go and explore a whole lot more of each person I show you. So Emma Lazarus is, of course, most known for her words on the Statue of Liberty. She's a Sephardic Jew born in New York, mid-19th century, and you can find out a lot about her in the Shalvi Hyman Encyclopedia. An image in case you don't know what the Statue of Liberty looks like, or the New Colossus poem. What I think you might not necessarily discover by exploring the encyclopedia is that she also left in her own archive distinct traces of lesbian desire. So I want to read one particular poem, though there are more. By the way, this is what the poem looks like in the archive itself. She left it in a notebook that she had envisioned as a sort of a collected poetry, though this poem was not reprinted until about 100 years after her death. We will soon see perhaps why. I'll read. Last night I slept, and when I woke, her kiss still floated on my lips, for we had strayed together in my dream through some dim glade, where the shy moonbeams scarce dared light our bliss. The air was dank with dew. Between the trees, the hidden glowworms kindled and were spent. Cheek pressed to cheek, the cool, the hot night breeze mingled our hair, our breath, and came and went as sporting with our passion. Low and deep spake in mine ear her voice. And didst thou dream this could be buried, this could be sleep, and love be thralled to death? Nay, whatso seem, have faith, dear heart. This is the thing that is. Thereon I woke, and on my lips her kiss. So I'm gonna be introducing a number of poems, so I won't go into deep detail with them, and we can do that more in the Q&A. But to me, this is a very encoded and yet at the same time explicit erotic lesbian dream. And it is not only a dream, nay, whatso seem, this is the thing that is. And it was so startling to me to find this explicit expression of lesbian desire about 100 years before American lesbian poetry really emerged as a poetic movement on the American scene and more globally. So of course, there are predecessors. It's not until 1976 that Adrienne Rich, for example, published her explicitly lesbian 21 love poems in her book, Dream of a Common Language. Now, to me, Rich was one of the women who first made this lesbian poetics public. But Lazarus proved me wrong by a whole 100 years. And interestingly, I was attracted to Rich for her lesbian poetics. And as I begin researching her more amongst other venues online, I was surprised to find her figuring prominently also in the Shalvi Hyman Encyclopedia, proudly taking up space both as a lesbian and as a Jew. So it's a bit of the reverse story of Lazarus, who, and again, just a click away between these two women. I delved into Rich's work and learned more and more about her complex positioning, born in Baltimore in 1929 to a Protestant mother and a Jewish father, as you can read along with me in the Encyclopedia. I learned how she grappled with her different heritages, struggled to forge her own Jewish identity, specifically over and against the erasures enacted by her predecessors, her father and grandmother. She writes about this really beautifully in her essay, Split at the Root, which appears in the wonderful 1982 anthology, Nice Jewish Girls, edited by Evie Torton-Beck, who was, I think, one of the original writers of the Encyclopedia back in the day, and such an important figure for Jewish women's history and lesbian, not just history, but politics. As Rich herself writes, the very fact of inheriting an uninterrupted legacy, either of Judaism or of women and lesbian writing, is in fact a privilege. Rich writes this in an introduction that she wrote to another poet who I want to read, Irina Klepfish. So I had the great honor really of writing the new entry for Irina in the Encyclopedia, which was harder than I thought it would be to try and concisely convey what I find so powerful about her poetry. Irina Klepfish worked in some of the similar circles to Adrienne Rich, both in terms of poetry, but also in terms of political activism. My favorite setting being the activist group, the Wilde Chayes, the Wild Animals, which spoke out publicly both against anti-Semitism in the lesbian movement and against the Israeli occupation and the war in Lebanon. So despite this similarity, though, I think a lot more people are familiar with Adrienne Rich's work than they are with Irina Klepfish's work. And I think this is due to her different positioning, also vis-a-vis her Jewish background, that complex heritage. Klepfish was born in the Warsaw Ghetto and was later raised just by her mother amongst Buddhist Jews. Her father perished in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. The Chulban, the Holocaust, figures prominently in her poetry, alongside groundbreaking and often heartbreakingly honest depictions of lesbian love, world history, so many different elements that come into play in her unique poetic language. But I think one of the things that really distinguishes Klepfish from Rich is the fact that alongside English, she chooses a language that is not common at all. She chooses to write bilingually in English and in Yiddish. She writes about Yiddish women poets. She's also a very important researcher and translator. at the same time as she herself becomes something of a Yiddish woman poet. So let's read one of her most famous and beautiful poems, Etliche Wörter auf Mameloschen. I hope you can all follow along with me in the screen or the PDF. Etliche Wörter auf Mameloschen, a few words in the mother tongue. Lemoshel, for example, die Kurve, the whore, a woman who acknowledges her passions. Die Yidne, the Jewess, the Jewish woman, ignorant, overbearing, let's face it, every woman is one. Die Ente, the gossip, the busybody, who knows what's what and is never caught off guard. Die Lesbianke, the one with erume, though we never use the word. Das Weibel, the wife, or the little woman. In der Heim, at home, where she does everything to keep Yiddishkeit alive. Yiddishkeit, a way of being Jewish, always arguable. In Mark, where she buys die Kartoffel und Challah, yes, potatoes and challah. Die Kartoffel, the material counterpart of Yiddishkeit. Mit Zwiebeln, with onions, that bring Tränen zu die Augen, tears to her eyes when she sees how little it all is. Weniger and weniger, less and less. Die Challah, braided, wie ihr Haar vor der Chasane, like her hair before the wedding, when she was a schön Mädel, such a pretty girl. Die lange schwarze Haar, the long black hair. Die lange schwarze Haar. A Frau cholmt, a woman dreams, ihr Ort auf der Welt, her place in this world. Und sie hat Meure, and she is afraid, so afraid of the words Kurve, Yidne, Yente, Lesbianke, Weibel. Sie cholmt, she dreams, und sie hat Meure, and she is afraid, ihr Ort, die Welt, die Heim, der Mark. A Mädel cholmt, a Kurve cholmt, a Yidne cholmt, a Yente cholmt, a Lesbianke cholmt, a Weibel cholmt, die Kartoffel, die Challah, Yiddishkeit. Sie cholmt die Haar, die lange schwarze Haar. Sie cholmt, sie cholmt, sie cholmt. So, Mazel Tov, we've just read a Yiddish poem, and even maybe dreamed a lesbian dream in Yiddish. And again, I urge you to spend more time with the poem to see just how brilliantly Kleppfish is working between the two languages, making us, by way of her game with translation, question how meaning is conveyed to begin with. Do we believe that the whore is a woman who acknowledges her passion? We through the encounter of Yiddish and English, we get to question both languages. And in fact, notice also how she places the queer content, not just in English over and against the kind of backwards Yiddish past. No, the lesbian is spoken most explicitly in Yiddish, die Lesbianke, whereas in English, we have the semi-homophobic kind of euphemism of roommate. Again, besides lesbian desire, this queer dream is also mixing past and present, forwards, backwards, open, secret, all by way of this Yiddish lesbian dream. So who is Kleppfish's speaker dreaming of? One person might be, I argue, Yiddish woman poet Kadia Molodowski, who Kleppfish writes about in one of her essays, writing about the way Kadia dreams, and compares herself to Kadia Molodowski in that Kadia, she says, is closer to the women in her family than Kleppfish has become, which is interesting if we compare the way Rich also looked at Kleppfish and thought of Kleppfish as closer than her to her legacy. So we see how much of a struggle it is to remain close, to maintain this legacy of Jewish women, of women's history, in general. So let's look at that dream poem that Molodowski has left us, that I think in a way Kleppfish is referring to. And of course, where would you go to learn about Katya Molodowski? The Shalvi Hyman Encyclopedia, another wonderful entry by Catherine Hellerstein, who has also made an invaluable contribution to the legacy of Yiddish women writers, specifically in her many years of beautiful translation, and also in her research on the history of Yiddish women's poetry. So we have here the poem. I'll read it in Yiddish, and then we'll read it in English. Freuenlieder. Es wellen die Freuen von unserer Mischpoche, bei Nacht in Chalomes mir kommen und sagen, wir haben ins Nies a läutere Blut über Deures getrogen. Zu dir es gebracht, wie Wein a gehitten, in koschere Kellers von unserer Herzer. Und eine wird sagen, ich bin an a Gune geblieben, wenn es denn in die Backen zwei reutliche Äpfel auf Bäumen noch gestanden. Und hab meine Zähne die Weiße zerkritzt in die einsame Nacht von der Wartung. Eure 17 haben wie fochige Beitsten geöffnet und haben mein Leben, mein Jungen, getrieben von Stub zum Ausgang von eure koschere Betten und Läufen. Nur ihr geht mir noch, wo die Gas ist nur dunkel, wo es fällt nur ein Schatten, und eure stille, verstickte Gewähnen jogen noch mehr sich wie herbstige Winden, und eure Rede sind seidene Fäden auf mein Mauch verbunden, und mein Leben ein ausgeflickt Blatt von der Sefer, und die Schure die erste verrissen. Women's songs. The faces of women long dead of our family come back in the night, come in dreams to me saying, we have kept our blood pure through long generations. We brought it to you like a sacred wine from the kosher cellars of our heart. And one of them whispers, I remain deserted when my 2 rosy apples still hung on the tree, and I gritted away the long nights of waking between my white teeth. I will go meet the grandmothers saying, your sighs were the whips that lashed me and drove my young life to the threshold to escape from your kosher beds. But wherever the street grows dark, you pursue me, wherever a shadow falls. Your whimperings race like the autumn wind past me, and your words are the silken cord still binding my thoughts. My life is a page ripped out of a holy book, and part of the first line is missing. So this poem was translated by none other than Adrienne Rich. Interestingly, as I mentioned, Rich did not have direct access to all of her Jewish legacy, and in fact worked on the translation with Yiddish translator Irving Howe. And it has been interesting working closely with it to see how much I feel it echoes also in some way Rich's lesbian poetics, that being driven away from the kosher bed by the whips of the mother's talks, those dark alleys, which is no place for a nice Jewish girl to be wandering. And indeed, a nice Jewish girl was not meant to be wandering, and more importantly, not meant to be writing. And so interesting that it's the act of writing that cuts Molodowski's speaker off from the women in her family who berate her for not upkeeping their legacy. And yet it's precisely her writing that brings their story into being, that gives it words, making this dream encounter in some way real. And yes, much like the women from the past come and haunt her, in my reading, I feel like we also have a chance to queerly haunt this poet past and be haunted by her when these stark divisions between past and present by way of dreams and by way of poetry, become newly permeable, allowing new conversations across time in the poem and between the poems. When I started this project, I thought that this conversation could only take place in my dreams. And imagine my surprise when reading Clubfish's essay, Forging a Woman's Link on the Golden Chain, on the Golden Chain. I came across this image. I can't ask you if you know who it is because I can't hear you, unfortunately. But we have Adrienne Rich, the young Adrienne Rich, and the elderly Kadia Molodowski. And to me, this is such a striking image because I was imagining myself staging this conversation between lesbian poetry and Yiddish women's poetry. And yet, as we see in this image, the encounter is very real. It's taking place in 1969. It's the 92nd Street Y. Suddenly here, Kadia Molodowski is herself a bobe, a grandmother, like the ones she is haunted by. And yet she isn't because she didn't have children to creepily haunt as she was haunted by. Rich, on the other hand, was not yet out as the lesbian trailblazer who she was to become, coming out just 3 years later. In this image, Rich and Molodowski share a stage, even if they do not share a common language. Do they share a dream?
Do you know who they're looking at? Sorry to interrupt.
I'm assuming yes. No, thank you. I feel like now I'm talking to someone. Hi, Judith. Yes, they are. I think I assume they're talking to the moderator, and I think it's a celebration of this translation of Yiddish poetry. And the man sitting next to them is John Hollander, who was also an acclaimed poet and translating in the same anthology.
He looks less interested than they are.
Isn't it incredible the way they're both looking to the same direction and the contest of the dark and light? But I was absolutely blown away because it really seemed to me like a connection I was making and this imagined dream-like dialogue, and it suddenly became so real and so embedded in time and history that Molodowski, aged out of the haunted young woman, that Rich grew into the lesbian activist, and it really embodies something of the reality of the queer dream that I'm starting to stage. And indeed, both of these women share a role in my dream of Jewish women's history. And Clubfish, I'm so happy to say, continues to play an active role in my queer Jewish present as a friend and as a poet who continues to publish work relevant to our current times and offering bilingual, lesbian, radical, poetic and politic commentary. And as Rich wrote of her, to inherit a history, we said, is a privilege. And to have access to the stories of all these women that I kind of brought together here is a privilege of having a history. And it's a privilege, I think, very much enacted by the Shalvi Hyman Encyclopedia. And it feels nothing short of a miracle, really, to be able to access so much of a wealth of information. And I want to close just by starting to imagine, what other conversations across time can this as a resource generate? I want to ask, what new queer Jewish dreams can be produced? And just to say, I really can't wait to find out. And I'm really eager to hear your comments on the poems, or if you want to expand the conversation to other Jewish women writers that you know from the encyclopedia or otherwise. I really welcome this discussion now.
Thank you so much, Zohar. That was just wonderful to hear you read the poems. It was incredibly moving to hear you read the Yiddish. My Yiddish is not good enough to catch more than a few words here and there, but just hearing the rhythm of it was so gorgeous. And I love the way that you put these poems and their writers in relationship with one another. And I particularly love the idea of these women slipping off the pages, their individual pages in the encyclopedia to visit one another. And part of why we try to also have essays that are not just biographical is to allow that kind of mingling and the kind of communal gatherings that can happen in that kind of scholarship. But it's really, it's a wonderful image there. There are so many things I want to talk about. I want to go back to where you started with Lazarus and ask you a little bit about, because you didn't really have a chance to go into this, but I think it's an important piece of the project, which is why is it that we didn't know about that poem? And why is it that certain parts of Lazarus's work and story were lost for so long?
I think it's an excellent question, and one that I think is so important for producers and users, say, of encyclopedias or history more broadly. And that's the most fundamental recognition that so much of women's history period is lost. You know, that it was a challenge for women to come to writing, and even when they wrote, it was a challenge to be preserved in history and passed on. When you add into that aspects that are kind of more controversial, shall we say, it goes without saying that we're going to be missing a lot of pieces. I think what's most amazing, though, is, as I mentioned, Lazarus herself included the poem. So she imagined it as part of her legacy. Her poems were first collected and published by her sister Josephine, who, by the way, was also not a fan of the highlighted emphasis on Lazarus's Jewish writing either. So it's not just the lesbian and the Jewish that the lesbian and the Jewish are kind of equally pushed to the side and have a chance to emerge later. The Jewishness emerged earlier on in recovery projects. In fact, Katja Moldovsky wrote really beautifully about Emma Lazarus. Katja Moldovsky had a series in the foreword in Yiddish of notable Jewish women where she profiled Emma Lazarus. She also wrote a screenplay. I think, I believe it was meant to be for television. It's just found in her archive, typewritten, but it has some camera movement descriptions. If anyone has any tips, I know she wrote some things for this JTS's Eternal Lights show, but I haven't been able to track down any production of it. But it's a short screenplay about Emma Lazarus that includes, you know, like a portrait come to life, different ghosts visiting her. Yeah, so this interest was enacted across history. I don't think that Katja Moldovsky picked up on the lesbian history, but who knows? You know, but these things are hidden in plain sight. I think that's what's so interesting, the fact that this notebook was available and you can go and see it in the Jewish Historical, the Center for Jewish History in New York. So it wasn't actually hidden, and yet it was not made public.
Right. I mean, I think that's part of what the part of the ongoing work of history is. We need to keep looking at the same things again and again, because we see completely different things each time. And when we put them in different contexts, as you're saying, you know, and we think about this with the encyclopedia too, that there are some people in the encyclopedia who you won't find any other information on them anywhere. But there also are people who there's plenty of information out there on them, but that information may not talk about their Jewishness, may not talk about their gender identity, you know, so those pieces are then dropped out of the story, and we lose a really important analytic lens for understanding their life and their context. One of the things—
could I just say, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that when I was copy pasting the links, I saw that there's a brand new entry that I didn't even know about in the encyclopedia about Esther Luria, who was someone who, when I came across her work, she published an almost identical series about notable Jewish women to Katja Moldovsky, but 10 years prior. And I found that, and it was so striking to me to have that repetition. And I think that need to repeat history is also part of this problem of transmission. But when I was trying to find out about her, I really was stumped. So I just saw this, you know, shortly before the talk, but I can't wait to get back on the encyclopedia and read all about Esther Luria.
So one of the things that I love about the way that you talk about poetry and sort of imagine poetry as a tool for recovering some of this history is that um, you're, I'm trying to think of the right sort of language for this. It's like, there's a sort of a process of recovering history. And then what we also know is that for the history that's not there, right, that wasn't written or that was lost, there, we also have to imagine ourselves into that space. So there's an imaginative process as well. And I think I gather from your work that that's part of what draws you to poetry, is that it provides that kind of imaginary or creative framework to fill in maybe what the documents might not have. So I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about sort of what you see as the relationship between history and the imaginary. And if I'm using totally terms that don't describe for you how you think about your work, then tell me what the right language would be or how you see it.
No, I love it. No, I think that's absolutely beautiful. I think it works. The imaginary is so important within poetry because it is so much about reading between the lines, kind of not taking things too literally, and that opening for potential encounter, potential history, potential desire. And I always have this kind of feeling that if I can read a desire into it, a poem or my desire into it, then it's there whether or not it ever was there. It could be there. And it really creates this dialogue that I do strongly feel is based on certain clues and affect of the poems. I don't take full credit for it. It really does feel like something cross-historical and dialogic. At the same time, I don't need to have it be real. It's not about unearthing. I know nothing about Emma Lazarus's actual sexual practice, nor do I need to. The poem is enough, and even half of that poem would be enough. There's something in that cross time dialogue that's opened up by poetry that's absolutely the pleasure is imaginary. And I also have to say that when I started some of this thinking, and when the lesbian poetry was really separate for me to the Yiddish poetry, I had this fancy. I was spending a summer researching in Warsaw, and I thought, I'm going to make up a lesbian Yiddish woman writer. I'm going to, I don't know, I'd stage photos, maybe I'll write poems. And then shortly after I was back, and there was a conference on Jewish women's voices at Mills College in California, I think in 2006. And then I was introduced to Irina Klepfish, and suddenly, she was more real than what I imagined. Just like that encounter of Moldovsky and Rich, occasionally we have to also face reality. And that's also not always simple. There are advantages to needing to imagine, getting to imagine history. It's not only a privilege to have to vie with your predecessors.
Right. Yes, I'm sure there are challenges to working on living poets as well, the poets who are in your life and in your work. I'm struck very much by the project of kind of finding queer ancestry in poetry and in history. And I certainly, I hope JWA will always be part of that work. And I think we also struggle sometimes with the tension between wanting to, to create that genealogy and to find that genealogy and the challenges of the kind of historic specificity of particular times and identities and language. And I'm thinking, for example, of one of my favorite historic figures and inspirations is Pauline Newman, who was an amazing labor activist for her entire life, basically for more than 70 years, who had a female partner and raised a child with her in the early 20th century, but who in the 1970s, when lesbian feminists wanted to claim her as a lesbian, was not psyched about that. She didn't see that terminology as applying to her. She didn't necessarily want to be claimed in that way. So I'm curious how you think about that in your work. And maybe I'm a historian, so I have to grapple with that maybe more than you do as someone who's working with poetry. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I definitely grapple with it both in my work, but I think most strikingly is when I went off around 2010, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed to this conference at CUNY called In America They Call Us Dykes, 1970s Lesbian Lives. And it was me and a whole little gang of other young self-identified queers. And it was not the most hospitable space, let me tell you. There was a lot of tension, simple things like just the fact of the word queer versus the word lesbian brought up a lot of tension to some of the women there. It seemed like an apolitical choice to choose queer, whereas to some of us, it seemed like in this day and age, queer held more of a political intervention than lesbian, for example. All sorts of tensions like that. There were a lot of tears shed at that conference. I have to say, though, that for my panel, the fact that I was working with Yiddish did serve as a kind of a common language and did offer a space of connection. And I had a great time dancing in the closing party with Effie Tortenbeck. And I did feel the potential of what I'm trying to imagine, because part of this queer genealogy is kind of saying, I don't want to need to rebel against generations before me. I think I want to think outside that framework and make these connections. But I think part of why a lot of 1970s lesbians turned back to Yiddish history is because it's easier to write about dead women. There's something about not, especially when, you're trying to invent a new language, not having to be in dialogue can be a blessing, and not being judged by the past. So it's a struggle over the meaning of words, also somehow a struggle over space. And I think that actually history, I don't think so much about conflict with history, though that is real, but about recruiting histories. I feel like we should be allowed to, as not a historian very clearly, I'm a big promoter of kind of taking liberty to pick and choose and use what we find useful for our present in history. And poetry is definitely readily available to that. But I think, I would definitely get in trouble historically. But I think also a thing that's really interesting about some of the ways that queer history works is, okay, so it does this messing with past, present, future, and takes all these liberties and celebrates anachronism. But I think to get queerness is also always very specifically a relationship of time and space. That is, what is queer now is different than what was queer. So there's a lot of materiality and historical grounding. And I'm so interested in, language and lived experience, and that it's actually activating these really disparate contexts that makes the tensions past and present so queer. So it's not about erasing historic specificity at all. It's a lot more about actually activating difference as well.
Right. I mean, and I think anybody who engages in any kind of historical work or looks to the past at all, which is really all of us, if they're honest, is in search of a usable past, as the social historians talked about. And we don't need the permission of the past to do that. It's challenging, but it's also our right to, it's part of the ownership that we have over history and part of what I think JWA tries to do in democratizing history is say history doesn't belong to experts, it doesn't belong to scholars, it belongs to each of us in terms of how we understand our relationship with it. As I was thinking about this session, I was going back to one of my favorite essays by Adrienne Rich, When We Dead Awaken. And she has this line in it that I think about often in relationship to my own work. And this is it. She writes, "We need to know the writing of the past and know it differently than we have ever known it, not to pass on a tradition, but to break its hold over us." So I'm curious whether do you see your work as part of that effort? Does that resonate with you in terms of how you think about the work that you do?
It's such a beautiful quote. I would say it's interesting. I'm trying to think. I would go back more to what you spoke of in terms of this usable past, and to me, it's not so much about revising kind of the material. So simply put, I was, raised in West Jerusalem in Zionist Israeli education. I received a very particular historical, linguistic, cultural legacy. So one point of kind of political historical intervention would be to go back and retell that and find new stories in Hebrew and revise that in kind of Rich's vein. But to me, actually, I kind of shifted to Yiddish and then brought it back in this comparative lens with Hebrew. But the rewriting is in finding a whole cultural legacy that, to a certain extent, was denied me in my Israeli education. And in doing so, I think the intervention, beyond adding the very important content of Yiddish writing, is that basic historical intervention that I think you were also talking about, of realizing, that we weren't told everything about the past, and that the past holds many more stories than the ones we are told. So I also think of what I'm trying to do is kind of offer a model for looking differently at the past and looking for a different past, and hoping to encourage others to find a past that they need to make the present more livable or the future more imaginable.
It's sort of like what you said about part of the beauty of poetry being that you are supposed to be reading between the lines, that so much of it is between the lines. And we can do that with history too, right? Like, what is the narrative that is the explicit narrative that is shared, and then what is not being said that is behind that narrative in some way. And how do we both pay attention to the explicit narrative and also be noticing what is not said, and how do we bring that forward in some sense so that they're in dialogue with one another.
Yeah, and I think the new encyclopedia and the way it also, as you described it, as now potentially constantly expanding online, is such a great model for that, because it kind of repairs some previous damages. There was a lot of lesbian erasure in the earlier one, and other things that you mentioned, that needed more attention. So this newer version both calls attention to that kind of reparative act, but also opens a whole new model of continuous edition, which is a different model of history, both democratizing and dynamic, that I think is so important.
Yes, and very daunting, I will say, as someone engaged in it, and because we're aware of the fact that so much of what we're trying to write about, and even if we're writing about it on a web page, which is much more easily edited than a printed volume that's on your shelf, so much of it is shifting, and we're aware of that constant shifting. And it feels scary to even write it down in some way that feels authoritative, even if it can be changed. We have a comment here from Lori Lefkowitz. Thank you, Lori, for adding this perspective. I'm going to read it. Thank you for the attention you're devoting to these poems. The celebration of anachronism is suggestive in such productive ways. My students are always stunned by the luxurious and sometimes harsh sexuality of Yiddish women's poetry, largely because it contradicts their association with both the Jewish grandmother and the Yiddish language. I think we need to do some work on the Jewish grandmother in the fullness of that complexity as I embrace a new identity. And yes, Mazel Tov, Lori, on your new grandson.
Oh, wonderful.
I love that. I find that too. One of my favorite things to show sometimes when I'm teaching about civil rights activists is a photo of the Emma Lazarus Federation of Women's Clubs, of Jewish women's clubs at the March on Washington. And they look like, I call it Bubby Goes to Washington. And they look like these bubbies in their hats and flower dresses and big bags, probably filled with sandwiches. And it's not what people have in mind when they think of the March on Washington. So I love that idea of challenging our image of the Jewish grandmother. Do you encounter this kind of surprise from your students?
Oh, absolutely. Also, in my current work, I'm really focusing on sex in Yiddish, both erotic poetry, but also scientific sexology, printed at the turn of the 20th century in Yiddish. And I think there's something to be said specifically for sex in Yiddish that does some really important work because of this sort of desexualized image of the past in its association with grandmothers and its association with women, and also just related to the trauma of the Holocaust and all other traumas of the 20th century. And I think being able to read an erotic Yiddish poet, to have in some way an erotic response to Yiddish literature does such important work in recognizing the corporality of the past, making the past real in this sense, but also in not allowing you that distance that is often enacted in humor, ridicule, different modes of really mocking Yiddish in some way that are also pretty central both in Israeli and I think American culture as well. So I'm thinking of sex in Yiddish also as a kind of reparative act that I enjoy people's surprise at, but also it's really important to me to not let it end with surprise or as a punchline, but rather what I really want to elicit is the erotic response that dirty poetry can invite.
I love that. I mean, I definitely feel like there's a lot of internalized anti-Semitism and misogyny in a lot of the ways that we talk about Yiddish, at least in the US and in Israel too. And I will say that on our site, one of the most visited pages is a blog post that we have that's about different Yiddish slang for vagina. And it always is very interesting to people. That and also a post of our material about Jewish hair, that's always very popular. And it's sometimes frustrating to me as a historian. I'm like, God, there's so much rich material here. And yes, Jewish hair is fascinating. And I'm always paying attention to my hair and how frizzy it is, but let's move on. There's lots of other things to talk about.
That's funny.
You just mentioned in passing trauma and the Holocaust. And I'm curious in your project of kind of thinking about how we weave through history and unearth different dreams, where does that history of destruction and trauma fit? I mean, it certainly is present in the poetry of several of the poets that you're discussing here.
Yes, and yet to a certain extent, I would say I go to great lengths to avoid it, which is itself a traumatic response, no doubt. But I think such an important response to how tied Yiddish is to the Churban, to the Holocaust. And really my encounter with Yiddish was based on the counter to that, on realizing that I knew so many minute details about the destruction and yet had close to no concept of what was lost, no concept of modern secular Jewish Yiddish culture and writing. So I give a lot more attention to not talking about the Holocaust and to trying it's the 1970s, 1920. But I think there is something to that weaving of an alternative history that is very healing. So
it's one of our challenges and frustrations at JWA also. I will say our content that has to do with the Holocaust is always among the most visited pages, that and Women of the Bible, which is great. I'm really excited that people are interested in recovering stories of women in the Bible, but I also will say that at least in my perspective, those are mythical women, and there's a lot of actually real women who have lived whose stories deserve to be known as well. And somehow it's easier sometimes to sit with the myth. So I part of my hope, actually, one of the things that we've talked about sort of jokingly, but not entirely with this edition of the Encyclopedia, is hoping to unseat some of the article on children in the Holocaust is a very heavily visited article. That's a great article. I'm glad people read that. And I also would like people to read about other topics when they're thinking about Jewish women. So we have.
And I think the Encyclopedia really invites that, though, because, you get to the end and everything is so just a click away. So I think, as opposed to a book on a shelf, I think that, we can bait and switch people and, have them come in for the Holocaust, but leave with something entirely different.
Exactly. Leave with queer ancestors that they didn't know about.
Exactly.
Yes, we don't hold people within the covers of a book. One last question, which maybe is too big of a question for the end, but I'm curious about your thoughts on this. I was thinking about the 4 poets that you talked about today. 2 of them are immigrants, refugees, and 2 are pretty assimilated Jews who come back to their Jewishness later. So I'm curious how you think about these 2 very different experiences vis-a-vis both Jewishness and Americanness in these poets.
Oh, that's such a great question. I don't think I had set it up that way in my mind. But I think kind of offhand, I would say that there's something to be said for the way that the 2 supposedly assimilated poets make explicit the queerness and the Jewishness in similar ways that might be kind of a key to answering that question. But I would have to think more about it. But but it's just so interesting also because they're so much more well known in some way, and Lazarus and Rich, and yet in some way through both of their lines there's such a deep desire also for these connections that Klutfish and Moldovsky very differently, but are able to embody in part by way of this linguistic connection of Yiddish. So I will continue thinking about that one though.
I was struck by it so much as
I
was hearing you read Mama Lushan and thinking about like what are the things that are so deeply embedded that they're always present, and what are the things that and then thinking about Rich's work to kind of recover her Jewish identity and come back to it. And even I didn't know that actually that she'd been part of translating Moldovsky's poetry. That's so beautiful to think of that, but also to think that she needed Irving Howe to be her kind of, go-between in some ways to make that possible. And there's like some pain there. Like why? Fine, Irving Howe, but like, why should he have to be in between them?
Yeah.
You
like
want
John Hollander beside them. Yeah.
Right. Like, I don't want him, but I'm picturing them like, I want them to be able to be like actually touching, not mediated by Irving Howe.
Yeah. And I think, that thought about what it means to touch unmediated is so interesting because in some ways, so many of the encounters that I'm imagining are mediated by me, by translation, by the encyclopedia, that there's something. So I connect to that frustration, and I also see it as an opening for our engagement as potential mediators. So maybe there's also something there that may have limited past encounters, but opens up space for future encounters mediated by all of you.
Well, I love that as a place to, I could talk to you about this for hours, and I look forward to continuing the conversation, maybe over a cup of coffee in New York or Boston or Tel Aviv. But that's a great place to end because we do see this encyclopedia as an invitation to the conversation. And I love your reframing that mediation is really an invitation to be part of the conversation and to expand access and engagement and open up the conversation in a different way. So thank you so much, Zohar, for this conversation. Thanks to all of you for being here. This was one of 6 sessions in our Global Day of Learning. We have one more session remaining in 1 hour with pioneering Israeli feminist Alice Shalvi, who's also one of the namesakes of the encyclopedia. I hope you will all consider joining us for that special conversation. It will be at the same link that you used for this session. Also just want to say that this launch represents the beginning of JWA's celebration of our 25th anniversary. So I hope all of you will save the date for a big virtual celebration we're planning for Thursday, November 4th. And we will be continuing to celebrate both the encyclopedia and all of the work of JWA throughout the year. So thank you all. Huge thanks to Zohar. And
thank you so much.
Until next time, everybody, be well.